Content note. Before we start, a quick heads up. This episode talks about gender-based violence, rape culture, and femicide. Take care of yourself as you listen. South Africa doesn't just have a violence problem. It has a patriarchy problem. And patriarchy? It's not just bad men doing bad things in dark alleys. It lives in churches and classrooms, in love songs and courtrooms, in WhatsApp groups, and the phrase, boys will be boys. In this episode, we're asking some uncomfortable questions. Why is violence against women so normalized here? Why are Black women carrying the heaviest cost of it? And why does every conversation about accountability still somehow center men's feelings? We're unpacking colonial patriarchy, African patriarchy, toxic gendering, rape myths, religion, media, and the politics of fear. With help from thinkers like Punla Dineo-Kakala, Audre Lorde, and many others who refuse to look away. This is an episode about systems and about what it will actually take to dismantle them. I'm Aurora Brown, and this is Intersectional Psychology. Stick around. Aurora Brown and Intersectional Psychology acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of country throughout South Africa and their connections to land, water, and community. We pay our respects to their elders past and present, and extend that respect to all Indigenous people listening today. Patriarchy, gender-based violence, and the architecture of fear in South Africa. Hello and welcome back to Intersectional Psychology. I'm Aurora Brown, I'm a registered counsellor. Today we're talking about patriarchy, but not the abstract textbook kind that lives safely inside lecture slides. We're talking about the kind that shapes who is believed, who is protected, who is blamed, and who survives. Specifically, we're looking at how patriarchal ideology in South Africa actively produces and sustains gender-based violence, or GBV. Not just through individual acts, but through institutions, culture, religion, media, and history itself. Through deeply ingrained social norms and structures that reinforce male dominance and female subordination. If you've watched The People versus Patriarchy, directed by Reha Desai and written by Eleke Boomer and Mickey Redelinghuis, you'll know this isn't subtle. Patriarchy isn't hiding. It's loud. It's normalized. And it's very good at pretending that's just the way things are. From a psychological perspective, that normalization is the point. Violence doesn't need monsters. It needs permission. Patriarchy as a system, not a personality flaw. One of the most persistent misunderstandings about gender-based violence is the idea that it's caused by bad men rather than powerful systems. Patriarchy in South Africa is deeply historical, deeply racialized, and deeply institutional. It didn't arrive alone. It arrived with colonialism, Christianity, racial capitalism, and apartheid bureaucracy in tow. That means patriarchy shows up everywhere. In families, in schools, in churches, in healthcare, in the police, in the courts, and yes, in our intimate relationships. And once something is everywhere, it becomes invisible. #MenAreTrash, and why #NotAllMen misses the point. The #MenAreTrash movement didn't emerge because South African women suddenly became rude or fed up on the internet. It emerged because violence became predictable. The murders of Karabo Mukuna in 2017 and Uyenene Mrwetyana in 2019 weren't shocking because they were rare. They were shocking because they were so familiar. #MenAreTrash wasn't a statement about individual morality. It was a structural diagnosis. The response, #NotAllMen, is psychologically fascinating. Because when confronted with systemic harm, the instinct wasn't curiosity or accountability. It was defensiveness. From a therapeutic lens, this is classic projection and deflection. I feel accused, therefore my accuser must be wrong. But feminists like Pumla Gokola remind us, if you benefit from a system and remain silent while it harms others, neutrality becomes complicity. The debate between #MenAreTrash and #NotAllMen opened a broader discussion on gender relations, accountability, and the need for systemic change in South Africa. These discussions have contributed to greater awareness and dialogue around GBV in South Africa, emphasizing the need for collective action and systemic change to create a safer and more equitable society for all. This was never about all men. It was about why enough men don't interrupt violence. Toxic gendering starts early, and it stays loyal. Patriarchy doesn't wait until adulthood. It gets to work early. Boys learn that aggression equals desire, dominance equals masculinity, and emotional repression equals strength. Girls learn that endurance equals love, sacrifice equals worth, and silence equals safety. Psychologically, this is conditioning, not coincidence. How often do you see young boys being rewarded for teasing or hurting girls? This behavior is seen as a sign of interest. Disciplining children with violence teaches them that violence is an acceptable way to assert control, as shown when parents say, "I'm doing this because I love you," while hitting their children. Men are taught that their quote-unquote natural virility means they lack self-control, especially when quote-unquote provoked by women, shifting the responsibility for safety and violence onto women. When violence is framed as discipline, love, or just how men are, it rewires moral reasoning. It teaches children that harm is relational currency. And once violence is justified in childhood, it doesn't need explanation in adulthood. Colonial patriarchy versus African patriarchy, a false binary. The question of whether patriarchy in South Africa is colonial or traditional is often framed like a debate with a winner. But that framing misses the point. Colonialism didn't invent patriarchy, but it weaponized it. Historically, civil disobedience in South Africa was met with physical and racial violence by the state, leading to intergenerational trauma and a cycle of violence. Colonial administrations froze fluid gender systems into rigid hierarchies. Customary law was rewritten. Male authority was formalized. Women's power was stripped of legitimacy. At the same time, pre-colonial societies were not gender utopias. Power existed, but it was often negotiated, contextual, and shared. Patriarchal elements existed in pre-colonial African societies, though often balanced with matriarchal or egalitarian practices. Mshweshwe notes that traditional African cultures sometimes emphasized male leadership and control over family and societal structures, which have been carried into modern times. Some African societies practiced patrilineal inheritance and leadership structures, prioritizing male authority. Yet women held significant roles in spiritual, economic, and social spheres. Modern South African patriarchy is a hybrid of colonial control, racial capitalism, and selectively remembered tradition. The debate over the origins of South African patriarchy is not about choosing one narrative, but understanding how these influences intersect. Recognizing both colonial and indigenous contributions to current gender relations allows for a more nuanced approach to addressing GBV and promoting gender equity, which means dismantling it requires both decolonization and feminist critique, not one or the other. Calling out offenders, justice, risk, and survival. Publicly naming abusers is often framed as reckless or emotional. But silence has never been neutral. Influenced by global movements like #MeToo, public naming of GBV offenders in South Africa aims to hold perpetrators accountable, disrupt the culture of silence, and support survivors. However, the Me Too movement did not fully address South African women's intersectional oppression, leading to local hashtags like End Rape Culture and Am I Next, which eventually eclipsed Me Too in South Africa. Movements like hashtag Am I Next and hashtag End Rape Culture emerged because formal justice systems repeatedly failed survivors, especially Black, poor, queer, and disabled survivors. Psychologically, disclosure is not just about truth. It's about restoring agency. At the same time, public naming does carry real risks, like retaliation, re-traumatization, legal consequences, and social exile. The question isn't whether survivors should speak. The question is why speaking remains dangerous. Balancing the need for immediate accountability with due process principles is crucial. Public naming can prompt swift action, but may undermine the legal process where evidence and formal procedures are vital. Critics advocate for strengthening formal justice systems to support victims and ensure fair trials for accused individuals, including improving police response, forensic capabilities, and victim support services. Some activists call for alternative justice forms, focusing on healing and restitution, rather than punitive measures alone, aiming to address the root causes of violence and create long-term change. Religion, tool of control or site of resistance? Religion plays a complicated role in GBV. It has been used to sanctify male authority, demand female submission, and spiritualize endurance of abuse. Religious doctrines, especially in Christianity and indigenous belief systems, justify and maintain male dominance. Misinterpretations of religious texts often perpetuate the belief that men have the right to discipline their wives, leading to domestic violence. Charismatic Christianity presents a nuanced view of religious movements in both challenging and reinforcing patriarchal norms. Some men in these communities adopt egalitarian practices, while others use religious justifications to uphold traditional gender roles, showcasing the ambivalence in religious responses to GBV. Christian men must also play a role in transforming gender relations and promoting gender equity within church institutions. Ademi Luka draws parallels between patriarchal structures in ancient Israel and contemporary African societies, showing how religious and cultural justifications for male superiority contribute to the abuse of women. Rakogzi discusses how patriarchal interpretations of Christianity reinforce GBV by promoting female submission and justifying male dominance. Waste and colleagues analyze the biblical story of Tamar to challenge patriarchal interpretations that justify violence and instead promote gender equity. Reinterpreting these stories through a feminist lens, religious communities can play a pivotal role in addressing and preventing GBV, aligning with Lord's advocacy for using anger and critical reflection to dismantle oppressive ideologies. Al-Bubekri explores the intersection of patriarchy and religion in Islam, arguing that patriarchy is not inherent to Islamic traditions. Instead, he calls for a nuanced understanding that separates cultural practices from religious teachings. Mokoena examines traditional African spirituality through a gendered lens, showing how spiritual beliefs can both support and challenge patriarchal norms. They call for a more equitable interpretation that empowers women. Piri highlights how African women theologians have challenged patriarchal interpretations of religious teachings, advocating for gender justice and emphasizing the importance of feminist theological perspectives in the fight for women's rights. Ogunyemi reconceptualizes Afrocentrism, challenging patriarchal interpretations of African subjectivity and advocating for a feminist Afrocentrism that centers African women's experiences and perspectives. But religion has also been a site of resistance. Movements like Mañano, feminist biblical reinterpretations, Islamic feminist scholarship, and African women's theology all show that faith is not inherently patriarchal. Jacobson and Pillay draw on Tutu's liberation theology to argue for gender justice from a theoethical feminist perspective, emphasizing the transformative potential of religious teachings when interpreted through a lens prioritizing equity and justice. Mutu Parayachi and colleagues demonstrate how women reclaim their spiritual spaces, highlighting the agency and resilience of women in challenging patriarchal constraints within religious contexts, and underscoring the transformative potential of women's collective action in promoting gender equity. The harm lies not in belief, but in who controls the interpretation. Nakane, a musician and actor, highlighted this in Rase Taba's film by stating, "Why can't we even envisage an all-knowing being like God as a woman?" That question alone destabilizes centuries of theological power. Patriarchal institutions and structures. Fear permeates women's lives in various contexts, such as workplace harassment, domestic abuse, and public violence. Fear is not just an individual experience, but a collective one reinforced by societal norms. legal and policy frameworks significantly impact GBV, either by perpetuating or by challenging it. Law enforcement and judicial systems often reflect societal biases, resulting in inadequate responses to domestic violence in Black and lower-income communities especially. Victims in these communities may receive less protection or justice due to systemic racism and classism. Du Toit critically examines South African rape laws and human rights discourses, arguing that legal reforms often fail to address the deep-seated cultural norms sustaining violence against women. They emphasize that sexual violence in South Africa is deeply rooted in both historical and contemporary patriarchal ideologies. The transition from apartheid to post-apartheid has transformed but not eradicated these ideologies, which continue to justify GBV. Educational and empowerment initiatives are essential for challenging patriarchal norms. Violence is normalized among girls in South African schools, revealing the pervasive nature of GBV in educational settings. Participatory decision-making in agricultural households can empower women and challenge traditional power dynamics. Feminist frameworks in higher education can promote gender equity and address systemic discrimination. Men navigate gendered terrains in early childhood education and care, highlighting how patriarchal norms constrain both women and men by reinforcing traditional gender roles. The resistance of women in South African academia against racial patriarchy shows how Black women professors face dual oppression from racial and gendered discrimination. This dual oppression creates a hostile environment that perpetuates GBV and marginalizes Black women's voices. These women's experiences underscore the pervasive nature of GBV and discrimination in academic settings, and the need for continued efforts to dismantle patriarchal structures. Their resilience and resistance are vital for challenging and changing these oppressive structures, serving as powerful testimonies to the ongoing struggle for gender equity in all sectors of society. The harsh work environment faced by Black African women domestic workers in post-apartheid South Africa illustrates how the intersection of race, class, and gender perpetuates violence and discrimination against women. Economic dependence on male partners due to high unemployment rates and limited access to education increases domestic violence. Women in poorer communities often lack the financial means to leave abusive relationships. perpetuating the cycle of violence. While wealthier women may have more resources to seek help and escape abuse, women in lower socioeconomic classes face significant barriers to accessing support services. Efforts to regender the South African military reveal significant resistance due to entrenched patriarchal and militaristic norms. These norms marginalize women and perpetuate a culture of violence extending into domestic settings. Including more women and adopting gender-sensitive policies would create a safer and more equitable military environment. This transformation requires confronting and changing deeply rooted patriarchal norms, mirroring the broader societal struggle against GBV. Media, fear, and the psychology of spectacle. Media coverage of GBV often turns women's suffering into spectacle. The high-profile case of Anine Boyson, whose brutal rape and murder in 2013 drew significant attention, highlighting the extreme violence women face and the entrenched misogynistic attitudes that allow such violence. Similarly, the case of Fezekile Tsukela Kuzwayo, known as Kwezi, who accused then Deputy President Jacob Zuma of rape in 2005, brought issues of power, gender, and sexual violence into sharp focus, despite the backlash she faced. Certain cases receive national attention, others disappear. Media coverage sensationalizes violence without addressing underlying issues of patriarchy and misogyny. Boonzayer delves into how femicide and other forms of GBV are often sensationalized, which can desensitize the public and perpetuate victim-blaming narratives. Comments about victims' appearances and racial imbalances in media coverage, such as in the case of Riva Steenkamp, highlight the need for more responsible and sensitive reporting. This creates a hierarchy of grief, where race, class, and respectability determine visibility. Despite these challenges, many survivors demonstrate remarkable bravery by speaking out. Gakmola highlights the stories of women who have broken the silence around their experiences of rape and GBV, challenging the culture of silence and demanding justice at great personal cost. Kwezi's public accusation against a powerful figure and the subsequent backlash exemplify the intense scrutiny survivors face. Yet her courage has inspired many others. Pumla Gaqola calls this a fear factory, a system that teaches women to self-regulate through fear. Fear of walking alone, fear of reporting, fear of not being believed. Yet even here, resistance emerges through survivor testimony, counter-narratives, and refusal to be silent. GBV as a racial and class phenomenon. GBV is not evenly distributed. Black women, poor women, migrant women, queer women all experience higher risk and fewer protections. Apartheid didn't just segregate land, it segregated safety. Under apartheid, Black women's bodies were hypersexualized and devalued, a legacy that continues to make them vulnerable to GBV. Class disparities mean poorer women lack access to resources and support systems, making them more susceptible to domestic violence and less likely to receive justice. Gaknola's 2021 Female Fear Factory highlights how racial capitalism exacerbates inequities, with Black women disproportionately affected by both economic exploitation and GBV. Black South Africans, particularly women, are disproportionately affected by poverty and unemployment, increasing their vulnerability to domestic violence. Black women face compounded oppression due to race, gender, and economic status, limiting their opportunities for advancement and exacerbating their vulnerabilities to violence. Domestic violence in poorer, predominantly communities of color, is more visible and subject to public scrutiny, while similar issues in wealthier, predominantly white communities may be hidden or ignored. Racialized experiences of patriarchy affect Black women and men differently, complicating the dynamics of GBV. Economic dependency traps survivors in violent homes. Policing biases limit justice. Racial stereotypes shape credibility. Black women face the double burden of racial and gender discrimination, resulting in systemic disadvantages in employment, education, and social status. Historical stereotypes of Black women as submissive and inferior perpetuate a culture of violence and control. And while Black men are also harmed by racial capitalism, patriarchy offers a dangerous compensation prize. Dominance at home when dignity is denied elsewhere. Black men who face systemic racism and economic disenfranchisement may express frustrations through violence against their partners. That doesn't excuse violence, but it explains how it's reproduced. Conclusion. What do we do with all this? Audre Lorde reminds us that anger is not the enemy. Unexamined anger turns inward. Collective anger, grounded in analysis, becomes fuel. Ending GBV requires more than awareness campaigns, though those do matter. It requires feminist education, economic justice, accountable legal systems, survivor-centered care, responsible media, and men willing to dismantle masculinity rather than defend it. Patriarchy survives because it adapts. So must resistance. And psychology, when practiced ethically and intersectionally, has a responsibility not just to heal individuals, but to name and dismantle the systems that keep harming them. If you haven't watched The People vs. Patriarchy, I'd highly recommend it. The film is available for free on YouTube, and I'll include a link to it in the show notes. And before you go, if you're a Patreon subscriber, we're taking this conversation further in the bonus segment. Because here's the question we didn't have time to sit with properly. What if patriarchy isn't just violent, but also deeply ordinary? In the bonus, we unpack how it shows up in society and how it trains all of us to call inequity culture instead of power. If you want that conversation, join us on Patreon. When patriarchy is understood as a system rather than an attitude, it becomes harder to treat violence as an accident. In the next episode, we'll take a careful, critical look at gender-based violence, not as a moral anomaly or a collection of individual crimes, but as something structurally produced and socially tolerated. This isn't an easy conversation, but it's a necessary one. That's next time on Intersectional Psychology. Until then, remember, everyone has the right to live with their optimal mental health. Thank you for listening to Intersectional Psychology. Please follow or subscribe to the podcast to get every episode. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review Intersectional Psychology in your preferred app. It really helps other people find the podcast. This episode of Intersectional Psychology was researched, written, recorded, and edited by me, Aurora Brown. For a transcript of this episode, please see the link in the show notes on your podcast app or go to intersectionalpsychology.com. You can also check the website or the show notes for a full list of references for this episode. A video of this episode with closed captions is available on youtube.com/@intersectionalpsychology. To support this podcast and get access to bonus content, including additional episodes and interviews, as well as more guided mindfulness sessions, please go to patreon.com/intersectionalpsychology. You can also chat with me on Blue Sky at intersectpsy.bsky.social and Instagram, Facebook, or TikTok at Intersectional Psychology. But mostly Blue Sky. Aurora Brown and Intersectional Psychology are committed to the Sight Black Women praxis. All episodes of Intersectional Psychology are for educational purposes only and are not intended to be a substitute for professional mental health advice, diagnosis, or treatment.
I, Aurora Brown, am not able to answer specific questions about individual situations. Always seek the advice of your health provider with any questions you may have regarding a mental health condition. Never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have heard or seen on this podcast. If you think you need immediate assistance, please call your local emergency number or any mental health crisis hotline. Everyone deserves good mental health.